Let's look at the protein recommendations for athletes. These guidelines have changed over time. What we know when we look at protein needs is that the RDA, or recommended dietary allowance for protein, it's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. To give you an example here, we've got a 23-year-old male who's 154 pounds. You divide the weight in pounds by 2.2 to get it in kilograms, and that equals 70 kilograms. You multiply that times 0.8, and that gives us 56 grams of protein. If you look at that, and we've already said that 1 ounce of meat is 7 grams of protein, then that's an 8-ounce serving of meat. You're probably getting that when you go to your local steakhouse, right? Pretty easy to get 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And remember what the RDA represents. It represents a healthy range for 97% of the population. The question is a healthy range an optimal range for athletes? And what we know is that it is not. It's a healthy range, but it's not optimal. And so when you start looking at the guidelines for athletes, we see these recommendations: 1.2 to 1.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which would be 0.55 to 0.64 grams per pound. The idea here is you want to make sure you're consuming enough carbohydrate so that the carbohydrate's providing the energy, because protein needs to do its job, and its job, as we know, is to build and repair tissue. And so you've got to be consuming an adequate amount of carbohydrate, enough so that the protein can really do its job, because you don't want the protein to be used for energy. And for strength athletes, the recommendations, depending on which guideline you're looking at, somewhere on the order of 1.2 to 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. I've even seen it as high as 2 and maybe even 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is actually 2 grams is 0.9 grams per pound, which is a far cry from the RDA, right, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram. We're almost doubling that here for strength and power athletes. In particular, you want to make sure that you're getting high quality proteins, and we'll talk about this later, but you want to be consuming whey and casein and soy, and all of these are considered complete proteins because they contain all the essential amino acids, and that's important. And there's differences between these types of proteins. Some are preferred more than others. All are important, but in general, the recommendations for strength athletes is anywhere from 1.2 even up to 2 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Just to sort of put this all together, let's say we got a 160-pound athlete. We do the math on that. That's 73 kilograms times 0.8, the RDA, and that's 60 grams per day. If you're looking at strength athletes, and I just took a moderate number here, 1.5 grams, if you do that, that's 110 grams of protein per day. And for endurance athletes, using the 1.2, that's 88, so 90. So you're seeing the differences in protein needs between endurance and strength athletes. And you got to think about why they need more, because these athletes are exercising to the extent where they're really tearing down that muscle, and they need to repair that muscle and build it back stronger. So they need to make sure they're consuming more protein. Oftentimes, though, you see some folks go overboard. I don't know that you need to consume 4 times the RDA, although I'll show you a study that actually did that here coming up, which is kind of interesting. Speaking of studies, I want to point this one out, and we don't often think about this, but this study by this fellow, Mayo, I guess that's his name, in this journal from the Journal of Nutrition about a year ago, looked at how protein was distributed and found that a moderate amount of protein 3 times a day stimulates synthesis to a greater degree than a large protein consumption towards the evening meal. And think about our typical meal pattern where we don't consume really oftentimes a lot of protein for breakfast, and then for lunch maybe we consume a little more, and then our highest protein meal is usually at dinner. And this study really stressed the fact that you really want a distributed protein consumption throughout the day, and that's going to stimulate synthesis to a greater degree. It's very important based on the studies that I've looked at, and this in particular, this one points it out. Now, you do get into the question, as I sort of alluded to earlier, can you consume too much protein? The jury's kind of still out on that. There's definitely a certain limit to what's needed for synthesis, and most of the studies have shown that anywhere from 25 to 30 grams of protein, and the most I've seen is 40 grams of protein per meal, is really all that your body can use at one time. Consuming protein in doses higher than 30 to 40 grams really isn't necessary. And to finish this section up looking at recommendations, I wanted to show you this study, and you guys can look this up, by Jose Antonio and his group. And if you look here, International Journal Society of Sport Nutrition in 2014, interesting study. Basically what they did is they fed subjects a hypercaloric diet. So they fed them more calories than what they needed for 8 weeks. This diet, the extra calories were coming from protein. So they consumed 5 times the RDA for protein. And if you look at the title of the article, The Effects of Consuming a High Protein Diet, they consume 4.4 grams per kilogram of body weight per day on body composition in resistance-trained individuals. And so what you might think would happen is because they're consuming way too many calories, more calories than they need, that they would gain weight. And they didn't. And so the results were they did not increase body weight, fat mass or fat-free mass, or percent body fat. So that's really kind of interesting. The question is why? And I think they hypothesized that, it requires more energy to digest protein, and so you can get away with consuming a little more protein than maybe what we had first thought. So it's an interesting idea. And I do believe this, that calories do count, but maybe a calorie is not a calorie. And there's definitely some evidence to back that up. So that's the guideline for protein. You're looking at endurance athletes anywhere from 1.2 to 1.5, if you want to call it that. Even up to 2 during really heavy training. In most cases, 1.2 to 1.5. And then for strength athletes, you can easily go up from 1.5 up to 2, maybe even 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and that seems to work. So our next section, we'll look at recommendations for fats, vitamins, and vitamins and minerals.